The banquet hall was alive with light and sound. Bright chandeliers cast a golden glow over the polished floor, and laughter bounced off the high walls. Servers moved quickly between the round tables, placing plates of food and refilling glasses. Music played softly in the background, but the real noise came from the dozens of voices talking over one another, greeting and celebrating. It was a special evening, an annual company event where executives, employees, and their families came together. Every table seemed full of friends or family members chatting happily, except one. In the far corner, away from the busy center of the room, sat Emily. Her wheelchair was neatly positioned at the edge of the table. In front of her was a small plate with a single slice of birthday cake. The cake looked fresh and sweet, its white frosting decorated with bright pink flowers made of icing. A silver fork rested on the plate, but Emily held it loosely as if she wasn't in any hurry to eat. Her shoulders were a little hunched, her head slightly bowed. She looked small in the large room, almost invisible to everyone else. She used the fork to cut a small piece of cake, bringing it slowly to her mouth. It tasted good, sweet and soft, but the flavor didn't matter much to her. Around her, people were smiling, hugging, taking photos. Some clinked glasses in little toasts, but no one came to her table. She kept her eyes on the plate, avoiding looking around too much. She had learned long ago that looking at people sometimes made them uncomfortable, especially when they weren't sure how to act around her. Emily's dress was light blue, matching the ribbon tied in her hair. She had dressed carefully for tonight, hoping it might be different from other events. She had imagined at least one or two people would join her, maybe an old family friend or someone from her father's company. But as soon as she entered the room with her father earlier, people had smiled politely, greeted the CEO, and then drifted away to their own tables. She had been left alone within minutes, quietly wheeled to the corner so she wouldn't be in the way of the busy movement in the middle of the hall. Every few minutes, she could feel glances from nearby tables. Some people looked curious, others quickly looked away. Emily wasn't new to this feeling. She had been born with a condition that made walking impossible, and even though she had lived with it all her life, others still didn't know what to say to her. Some acted overly cheerful, talking too loudly or too slowly. Others avoided speaking altogether. Either way, the result was the same: silence at her table, while everyone else had company. She tried to distract herself by paying attention to little details. She noticed the way the candlelight flickered on the shiny silverware. She listened to the way the ice in someone's glass clinked when they took a sip. She admired the fresh flowers placed in the middle of each table. For a few seconds, she could almost pretend she was just enjoying the calm. But then a burst of loud laughter from the table nearest to hers reminded her of the gap between her world and theirs. Her father was across the room, surrounded by other executives. He was shaking hands, leaning in for quick conversations, nodding seriously at someone's words. He was always busy during these events. Emily didn't blame him. She knew his position as CEO came with responsibilities. But sometimes she wished he would remember that she wasn't just fine on her own. She wanted to be part of the world around her, not sitting at the edges of it. The cake in front of her was slowly disappearing, bite by bite, but she ate without enthusiasm. The sugar left a slight dryness in her mouth. She sipped water from the glass beside her and set it down carefully. A waiter passed by and smiled politely, but didn't stop to say anything. She gave a small, automatic smile back, the kind you give when you don't want someone to feel awkward. In her mind, she imagined what it would be like if someone pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. They might ask about her cake or how her evening was going. Maybe they'd tell her something funny that had happened to them that day. They wouldn't look at her wheelchair first. They would look at her eyes. She could tell them about the book she was reading or the photography project she had started at home. They might even ask to see her pictures. That kind of moment could make the night feel different, less empty, less lonely. But as the minutes passed, no one came. A group of 3 walked past her table, deep in conversation, not even glancing her way. She stirred the frosting on her plate with her fork, drawing little patterns before scooping up another bite. The sweetness felt heavier now, almost tiring. The music changed to a slower tune, and some couples stood to dance in the open space at the center of the room. Emily watched them for a while, the way they moved easily, without thinking about each step. She tried to imagine what that kind of freedom might feel like. The air in the hall felt warm from all the people and the constant movement. She brushed a strand of hair from her face and adjusted her position in the wheelchair. Across the room, someone called her father's name, and he turned away from her direction. She knew she wouldn't be leaving soon. Events like this always lasted late into the night, and she had learned to quietly endure them. Still, she couldn't stop the tiny hope in her chest that something, anything, would change before the evening ended. She didn't want a grand gesture, just a simple moment of connection. Even one person, willing to sit with her, could turn the whole night around. She looked at her half-empty plate of cake and thought, maybe next year will be better. But deep inside, she wished it could be tonight. David sat at one of the tables closer to the middle of the hall, his seat giving him a clear view of most of the room. He wasn't part of the executive crowd. His work was in logistics, the kind of department most people didn't notice unless something went wrong. He had been invited to the event because the CEO liked to include employees from every branch of the company once a year. And for David, it was a rare chance to dress up and enjoy a nice meal. He was surrounded by coworkers from his department, all chatting about work, family, or the food. His plate was half empty, but his attention kept drifting away from the conversation. Each time his eyes wandered across the hall, they landed on the far corner, where a young woman sat alone at a table. He didn't know her name at first, but he had seen her before, once in the company lobby when she came to meet her father, and another time during last year's event when she'd also been sitting by herself. It wasn't just that she was alone, it was how still she seemed compared to the lively energy around her. People walked past her table without stopping. Some glanced at her for a second before looking away. She kept her focus on the small slice of cake in front of her, her fork moving slowly as if each bite was something to pass the time rather than to enjoy. David noticed the wheelchair, the way her hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, and the small, careful way she moved. He had a little sister who had gone through something similar. When his sister was in school, she had a limp from a childhood injury. She could walk fine, but kids treated her differently. They didn't always mean to, but she often found herself eating lunch alone. David remembered the way it used to hurt him to see her sitting there, pretending she didn't care. Those memories came rushing back now as he watched Emily from across the room. His coworkers laughed at a joke, and he smiled politely, but his thoughts stayed on the girl in the corner. He could see the same invisible wall around her that he'd seen around his sister. The kind of wall people built without realizing, made of uncertainty, awkwardness, and the fear of saying the wrong thing. It was a wall that could only be broken if someone chose to walk right through it. David leaned back in his chair, his mind debating whether to do something. On one hand, she was the CEO's daughter. People might think it was strange for someone like him, a mid-level employee, to approach her. What if it embarrassed her? What if it made things worse? On the other hand, leaving her alone felt worse than the risk of an awkward moment. As he watched, Emily brushed a piece of hair behind her ear and looked down again, her expression so closed off it almost made him stop thinking about going over. But then she looked up briefly, scanning the room as if searching for something, or maybe someone, and for the briefest moment, he caught a glimpse of loneliness in her eyes. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but David recognized it instantly. It was the same look his sister used to have when she came home after a bad day at school. The decision was made before he fully realized it. He pushed his chair back and stood. A couple of his coworkers noticed and asked where he was going, but he just said, "I'll be back in a minute." He picked up his drink, not because he planned to drink it, but because holding something gave his hands something to do. The walk across the hall felt longer than it should have. He was aware of people noticing him, some glances quick and curious, others confused. He ignored them, his focus locked on the table in the corner. With each step, he thought about how best to start. He didn't want to make her feel like she was a charity case. He wanted her to know he was coming over because he wanted to talk to her, not because he felt sorry for her. When he reached the table, Emily looked up, her fork still in hand. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. People didn't just walk up to her table like this, especially not people she didn't know well. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether to smile or frown. David gave her the kind of smile that wasn't too big or forced. It was gentle, like the kind he gave his sister when she was having a bad day. "Shall we sit?" he asked, his voice steady but warm. The question was simple, but it gave her a choice. He wasn't telling her he was going to join her. He was asking if she would let him. She hesitated, glancing around the room as if checking whether anyone else was watching. They probably were. The corner of her mouth twitched, and then she said softly, "You can if you want." Her tone was careful, almost testing. David nodded once, pulling out the chair across from her. He sat down and set his drink on the table, leaning forward slightly so he wasn't towering over her. He didn't mention her being alone, didn't talk about her wheelchair, didn't bring up her father. Instead, he just acted like this was the most natural thing in the world, like they were two guests at the same party who had chosen to share a table. From across the hall, a few people turned their heads to watch, but David kept his eyes on Emily, making sure she felt like she was the center of the conversation, not the center of attention. Her grip on the fork loosened just a little, and for the first time all evening, her posture shifted. Not much, but enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, she felt less alone. Emily's eyes followed him as he pulled the chair closer to her table. She wasn't used to people approaching her so directly. Usually, if someone needed to talk, they would hover for a moment, say a quick hello, and then leave. This man, David, didn't hesitate. He moved with the calm confidence of someone who didn't see her as a problem to solve. That, in itself, felt strange. She had learned to read people's faces over the years. Many wore that expression, half smile, half pity, that made her chest tighten. But David's expression was different. His smile was warm but not overdone, his eyes steady and focused only on her, not on the wheelchair or the space it took up. For a moment, she felt unsure whether to let this conversation happen. A part of her wanted to stay in the quiet bubble she had built around herself tonight. Another part wanted to see what would happen if she let someone in. "You can if you want," she had said, and her voice had sounded more guarded than she intended. It wasn't meant to push him away. It was just the habit she had learned. Keep things distant so they couldn't hurt later. David pulled the chair out and sat down. The scrape of the chair legs on the polished floor was loud for a second, making Emily's fingers twitch slightly on the fork. Once seated, he leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly on the table, as if he was settling into a conversation that had been waiting for them both. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't the heavy, awkward silence Emily dreaded. It was a pause, a small breath before the first step into something new. David glanced at the cake and tilted his head with a playful look. "That cake any good?" he asked. His tone was light, as if they were already friends sharing casual thoughts. Emily blinked, a little surprised by the simplicity of the question. Most people started with polite but predictable lines. "How are you?" or "Lovely evening, isn't it?" His was different. She looked down at the cake, cut off a small piece, and said, "It's sweet." David chuckled softly. "Sweet is good. I've got a sweet tooth. If I were sitting here alone with that slice, I'd probably eat it in 3 bites." The corner of Emily's mouth lifted before she could stop it. It wasn't a full smile yet, but it was a start. He leaned back slightly, his body language relaxed, but his eyes stayed on her, not drifting toward the rest of the room. It felt strange to be looked at like that. Not stared at, but seen. She found herself meeting his gaze more than she usually would with a stranger. "So what's the occasion for the cake?" he asked. Emily hesitated, unsure how much to tell. "It's my birthday," she admitted, her voice quiet, almost as if she didn't want the whole room to hear. David's eyebrows lifted. "Really? Well, happy birthday, Emily." The way he said her name caught her off guard, like he had taken the time to learn it, not just picked it up from overhearing. "Thanks," she replied, and this time her voice was a little steadier. He didn't ask her age or make a joke about birthday wishes. Instead, he started telling a story about his own last birthday, how his coworkers had gotten him a cake but accidentally ordered one with "Congratulations on your retirement" written across it. Emily laughed quietly at the thought, and he smiled as if pleased he'd gotten that reaction. They moved on to small, safe topics. He told her about a time he tried to bake cookies and ended up with something that looked like burnt pancakes. She told him about a photography project she was working on at home, though she kept the details short. He didn't press her for more, just nodded like it was genuinely interesting. As the minutes passed, she noticed her shoulders beginning to relax. The fork in her hand felt less like a shield and more like just a piece of cutlery again. She took a sip of water, feeling her voice might come more easily now. "You work here?" she asked. "Logistics," he said, "mostly behind the scenes, making sure things get where they're supposed to be. Not as glamorous as what your dad does, but it keeps the place running." She tilted her head. "Sounds important." He smiled. "It is. Though between you and me, sometimes the most important jobs are the ones nobody notices." Emily knew what he meant. She often felt like one of those unnoticed parts herself. Every so often, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. People passing, glancing their way, perhaps surprised to see her with company. Normally, that kind of attention made her uncomfortable. Tonight, it felt different. David wasn't watching them, wasn't paying attention to who might be judging. He was here, at her table, fully present. It was only a short conversation so far, but something about it felt solid, like a small bridge had been built between two lonely islands. Emily wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time that night, the air didn't feel so heavy. The cake didn't seem so tasteless, and she found herself wondering, not anxiously but with curiosity, what he might say next. At first, their conversation moved slowly, like two people stepping carefully onto thin ice, testing each step before taking the next. Emily answered his questions with short replies, sometimes only a word or two. It wasn't because she didn't want to talk, it was because she didn't know yet if she could trust that this wouldn't turn into another awkward exchange that ended too soon. She had learned to keep her guard up, especially at events like this, where people often spoke to her for a few seconds out of politeness and then excused themselves. David didn't seem in a hurry to leave. He didn't fidget or glance toward other tables as if waiting for a better conversation. Instead, he looked at her like she was worth his full attention. When she gave short answers, he didn't push or fill the silence too quickly. He just gave her space, letting her choose when to say more. He asked about the cake again, teasing her gently that she was eating it too slowly. She smirked a little, saying she was enjoying it at her own pace. He grinned and told her he could never do that. He'd probably eat half the cake before realizing he was supposed to share. That made her laugh quietly, and he caught the sound with an expression that said he was glad he'd found it. From there, he started telling her small stories about things that had happened to him recently. He spoke about a delivery truck at work that had broken down in the worst possible spot, blocking the CEO's reserved parking space, right before an important meeting. He told her how he had to direct traffic himself while making sure the truck got moved in time. Emily could almost picture him in the middle of the chaos, waving his arms, trying to keep everyone calm. She found herself responding with more than one-word answers. She told him that she liked photography, though she quickly added that she wasn't that good yet. David shook his head and said, "If you love doing it, you're already better than most people who never try." The comment caught her off guard. She wasn't used to strangers encouraging her like that without knowing her well. The more they talked, the more her voice began to lose that careful, measured tone she used with most people. She even told him about a recent photo she'd taken of a sunset over the city skyline, how the clouds had looked like soft pink feathers stretching across the horizon. He listened without interrupting, nodding as if he could see it clearly in his mind. David had an easy way of talking. He didn't make his stories about himself too much, and he didn't turn every moment into advice or a lesson. He simply shared, laughed at his own mistakes, and let her be part of it. When she made a small joke about how people probably thought he was brave for sitting with the CEO's daughter, he leaned in slightly and said, "I'm not here for them. I'm here for you." Something in the way he said it made her feel seen, not just noticed, but truly acknowledged. It wasn't the kind of attention she got from people who treated her differently because of her wheelchair. This felt normal. comfortable. She realized that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about the way she looked sitting there alone or whether anyone in the room was judging her. Her focus was on the person in front of her and the conversation they were building together. The noise of the banquet, the clinking glasses, the laughter, the music faded into the background. A server passed by and glanced at their table, perhaps surprised to see her talking and smiling. Emily noticed, but didn't care. David asked her if she had any plans after the event, and she shrugged, saying she'd probably just go home. He nodded thoughtfully, as if filing that away in his mind. The small changes in her body language would have been obvious to anyone paying close attention. Her shoulders had dropped slightly from their stiff posture. She was holding her fork in a looser grip, no longer using it as a way to keep her hands occupied in silence. She was meeting his eyes more often, and each time she did, she held the gaze for a second longer than before. The conversation drifted to light topics again. David told her about a time he tried to fix his kitchen sink and ended up flooding half the apartment. Emily laughed harder than she expected, covering her mouth for a moment before shaking her head. He pretended to be offended, saying, "It wasn't that bad." "Well, okay, it was. But at least I learned to call a plumber first next time." That laughter, genuine and unforced, made the room feel different to her. It was as if a layer of cold air had been lifted from her corner, replaced by something warm and alive. She realized she hadn't looked at her phone once since he sat down. She didn't feel the need to check the time or distract herself from the moment. Every now and then, her eyes would wander past him, catching sight of people glancing at them. She noticed one woman whispering to the person beside her while looking their way. In the past, that would have made Emily's chest tighten, wondering what they were saying. But now, with David sitting across from her, it didn't seem to matter. He was here, talking to her as if none of the rest of the room existed. The more they talked, the more she realized how rare this kind of interaction was for her. No one was pretending. No one was rushing to end the conversation. No one was making her feel like she was an obligation. For once, she wasn't the girl sitting alone in the corner. She was just Emily, sharing stories and laughing with someone who genuinely wanted to be there. People around the room began to notice what was happening at the small table in the corner. At first, it was only a few glances, quick looks as someone passed by, but slowly, more eyes turned in that direction. Whispers started between tables, voices low enough not to carry, but the glances gave away their curiosity. It wasn't common to see the CEO's daughter talking so openly with anyone outside of her family, especially not with someone from a different department. Most people in the company kept their distance from her, not because she was unfriendly, but because they didn't know how to approach her without feeling awkward. Now, she was sitting with David, leaning forward slightly, smiling at something he had just said. For Emily, the shift was subtle but powerful. She could feel the change in the air, the way the room seemed to acknowledge her presence now. But instead of making her uncomfortable like it usually did, she felt lighter. It wasn't because people were looking, it was because someone was looking at her for the right reasons. She was talking about her photography, her hands moving slightly as she described how she liked capturing small details, raindrops on glass, the shadow of a bird on a wall, the way light could turn an ordinary street into something magical at sunset. She expected David to nod politely like most people did when she mentioned her hobby, but instead, he asked real questions. What camera do you use? Do you take most of your photos outside or at home? His interest wasn't fake. He listened like he actually wanted to know. The more she spoke, the more animated she became. Her voice gained warmth and rhythm, and her words flowed without the usual hesitation. David kept the conversation moving naturally, asking her about her favorite photo so far, and she told him about a shot she had taken during a foggy morning, how the mist had blurred everything except a single bright yellow leaf on the ground. He said he wished he could see it, and she promised to show him someday. From other tables, people were still watching. A few seemed puzzled, maybe even disapproving. Others looked more curious, as if they were seeing a side of Emily they had never really noticed before. She was no longer the quiet figure sitting alone at the edge of the event. She was part of the evening now. David didn't appear to notice the attention, or if he didn't care. He kept his focus on her, asking follow-up questions and laughing when she made small jokes. Every time she said something that surprised him, his eyebrows lifted and his smile widened, like she had just told him a secret worth keeping. Emily realized she hadn't thought about her wheelchair once since he sat down. The part of her that usually worried about how people saw her, the assumptions they made, was quiet. It was replaced by the simple, refreshing feeling of being in a conversation where she was just herself. As the conversation went on, she learned small things about him too. He told her that he didn't own a camera, but had always admired people who could take good pictures. He mentioned how his job in logistics sometimes felt like solving puzzles under pressure, making sure things ended up in the right place at the right time. She told him that sounded stressful, but he laughed and said, "Only if you forget to breathe." The sound of her own laughter surprised her. It wasn't forced, it wasn't polite, it was real. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like that at one of these events. At one point, David leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, you make it hard to believe you were sitting here bored before I showed up." She tilted her head and gave him a look that was half playful, half serious. "Maybe I was just waiting for someone worth talking to," she said. He grinned at that, and for a few moments they simply looked at each other in comfortable silence. It wasn't the awkward kind of silence that made her want to reach for her phone. It was the kind that felt like a pause in music, giving both of them space to take in the moment. Around them, the event continued. Glasses clinked, cutlery scraped against plates, and music played in the background. But for Emily, all of that had faded into something distant. Her focus was on the person across from her and the unexpected connection they were building in a place where she had expected nothing but another lonely evening. She noticed that people were no longer just glancing at her table out of curiosity. Some were smiling faintly, as if they were glad to see her engaged in a conversation. Others looked a little confused, perhaps wondering how this simple interaction had happened when so many had chosen not to approach her. None of it mattered. What mattered was that for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was part of the world inside this room instead of sitting on the edge of it. And all it had taken was someone sitting down, looking her in the eye, and treating her as if she belonged. From across the hall, her father finally noticed her. The CEO's sharp eyes moved over the tables as he finished speaking to a small group of executives, and then they stopped when they found Emily. His gaze settled on her, his expression unreadable. He didn't move toward her right away. He simply stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass, watching her. Emily didn't notice at first. She was too busy telling David about the different times of day she liked taking pictures. She explained how early mornings felt quiet and private, how sunsets were full of color and drama. David listened, nodding, asking which one she liked more. She thought about it for a second and said mornings, because the world felt like it belonged to her for a little while. David smiled at her answer, but he had already caught sight of the man watching them. He recognized him immediately, the CEO. Everyone in the company knew his face. David could feel the weight of the man's stare, but he didn't let it show. He kept his focus on Emily, his tone steady, his body language calm. The CEO's gaze was heavy, the kind that could make most people shift in their seat. David didn't shift. He didn't lower his eyes or cut the conversation short. He just asked Emily what her dream travel destination was. She didn't notice the question was partly to keep her from looking around. She smiled faintly and said she wanted to go somewhere with wide open skies, maybe Iceland to see the northern lights. Her voice grew softer as she described seeing photos of glowing green and purple colors twisting above snowy mountains. David leaned in, genuinely interested. "That sounds incredible. You'd take amazing photos there." Finally, Emily glanced up, maybe following David's eyes for a second, and saw her father. She froze. Her fork paused midair. A familiar tension crept into her shoulders. The CEO's expression still didn't change. He was impossible to read, but his attention was fixed completely on them. For Emily, that moment brought back every time her father had stepped in to control a situation, to protect her, to decide for her. She wasn't sure what he was thinking now. Was he surprised? Annoyed? Curious, she quickly looked back down at her plate, her mind running through possibilities. She didn't want David to get in trouble for something as simple as talking to her. David noticed her sudden stillness. Without glancing again at the CEO, he said lightly, "You didn't tell me your favorite season for photography." The question broke her focus just enough to make her look at him again. "Autumn," she replied after a pause. "The colors are alive." The words made him smile. "Figures. You seem like someone who notices the little details other people miss." His voice was warm, calm, like nothing in the room had shifted at all. Emily felt a small knot in her chest loosen. The CEO eventually turned away when another executive approached him with a question. Emily let out a quiet breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She glanced at David, trying to read whether he had been bothered by her father's watchful eyes, but he just gave her that same steady look, the kind that said, "You're safe. I'm not going anywhere." The room went on around them. A waiter passed by, refilling glasses. Somewhere near the stage, a group of employees clapped at something the host said. Emily shifted her chair slightly, finding a more comfortable position, and returned to the conversation. David asked if she had ever thought about showing her photos in an exhibit. She shook her head quickly, almost laughing at the idea, but he said, "I'm serious. You talk about them like they're treasures. Other people would see that in your pictures." The comment stayed in her mind longer than she expected. Most people brushed off her photography as just a hobby to pass the time, but David talked about it like it mattered, like it was something worth sharing with the world. A soft hum of voices filled the background, but the two of them stayed locked in their small bubble. Emily felt the lingering awareness of her father somewhere in the room, but it didn't weigh as heavily now. David's calm presence made it easier to breathe, easier to remember that this was her moment too, not just his event. For the rest of their conversation, she stopped glancing toward her father. She stopped worrying about who was watching. She began to realize that someone sitting with her wasn't something she had to explain or justify. It was just normal. And maybe that was what she had been craving all along. As the evening began to wind down, the music softened, and the noise in the hall settled into a gentle murmur. People were standing, saying their goodbyes, gathering their coats. Plates were being cleared from the tables. Emily noticed the change in the atmosphere and knew the event was almost over. A small part of her felt the same familiar relief she always did when it was time to leave. But this time there was something else. A quiet disappointment that the conversation she was having might soon end. David glanced at his watch, then back at her as if reluctant to get up. She looked at her plate, which now had only a few crumbs of cake left. She slowly set down her fork and adjusted her hands in her lap. He leaned back in his chair, smiling a little. "Well," he said in a warm voice, "I guess they're closing things up." Emily nodded, but didn't know what to say. There was a pause. One of those moments when it feels like the goodbye is about to happen. David reached for his glass, took a small sip, then placed it down as if he wasn't quite ready to leave. Finally, he stood up, pushing the chair back quietly. "I should let you go," he said. His tone was casual, but there was a hint of hesitation, like he wasn't sure if walking away was the right thing to do. Emily looked up at him, meeting his eyes for a second, longer than she intended. Before she could stop herself, the words came out, soft, almost trembling. "Thank you for sitting with me." Her voice carried more meaning than the simple sentence suggested. It wasn't just thanks for sharing a table, it was thanks for noticing her, for treating her like she belonged, for making the night different from all the others. David's face softened. He gave her a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. "You deserve more than just a seat, Emily. You deserve to be seen." He said it simply, without drama, but the words stayed with her instantly. She didn't know how to respond. No one had ever put it like that before. She had been told she was strong, that she was brave, that she handled herself well, but being told she deserved to be seen, it was something entirely different. It was like he had quietly understood what she'd been feeling for years without her ever saying it. David took a small step back, nodding politely toward her before turning away. She watched him walk across the hall, weaving past the other tables, his tall frame moving steadily toward the exit. She noticed that he didn't rush. He walked as though he had no reason to hurry. A few people glanced at him, perhaps still curious about why he had spent so much of the night at her table, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Emily stayed seated for a moment after he was gone, her hands resting on the edge of the table. She stared at the empty chair across from her, feeling the warmth of the conversation still lingering in the air. The sound of laughter from another corner reached her ears, but it didn't make her feel separate anymore. The hall didn't seem quite as big or as cold as it had earlier in the evening. Her father appeared at her side a few minutes later, ready to leave. He didn't say anything about David, didn't ask who he was or what they had talked about. Maybe he had been watching long enough to know that the details didn't matter, that what mattered was how she felt now compared to when she first sat down. As they left the hall together, Emily's mind replayed moments from the conversation. The way David had asked her about her favorite season for photography, the way he had laughed at her jokes, the way he had looked at her without pity or discomfort. Those small things felt bigger now, as if they had shifted something inside her. The night air outside was cool, brushing gently against her face as they moved toward the car. She glanced up at the sky and noticed the faint glow of a few stars, their light, quiet but steady. It reminded her of the way David's presence had felt, subtle but warm, making the darkness seem less empty. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but she knew she wanted to. More importantly, she knew that even if she didn't, the memory of tonight would stay with her. It would be a reminder that one conversation, one moment of kindness could change how a whole evening, and maybe even how a person, felt. Inside, she carried the echo of his words, "You deserve to be seen." It was the kind of thing she might never say out loud to anyone else, but it was now a quiet truth she could hold on to. And for the first time in a long while, as the car pulled away from the glowing building, she felt something she hadn't expected when the night began: hope. The next morning, David sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, ready to start his day. His phone buzzed with a new email notification. He almost ignored it, thinking it was just another work update, but the sender's name caught his attention. It was from the CEO's office. His first thought was that maybe he had done something wrong the night before, that perhaps sitting with Emily had been seen as crossing a line. But when he opened the email, the subject line made him pause. Invitation from Emily. The message was short, written by the CEO's assistant. Emily wanted to meet him for coffee that weekend, and she had asked specifically for it to be arranged. David leaned back in his chair, a small smile forming on his face. She hadn't just been polite last night, she had actually wanted to see him again. When Saturday came, they met at a small cafe near the city park. Emily was already there when he arrived, sitting by the window with her camera on the table. The early sunlight poured in, making the lens of her camera glint softly. She looked different outside of the banquet hall, more relaxed, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, her hair tied back loosely. David ordered a coffee and joined her. They started with light conversation, but it quickly became clear that this wasn't just going to be small talk. Emily told him more about her photography, even showing him some of her pictures on the camera screen. He was genuinely impressed. Her photos weren't just good, they had a way of making ordinary things feel alive. A puddle on the street became a perfect mirror of the sky. A worn park bench looked like it held stories from decades past. David asked questions, not out of politeness, but because he wanted to understand the way she saw the world. Emily, in turn, asked him about his life, how he'd started in logistics, what his days were like, whether he had always lived in the city. They traded stories for hours, the conversation flowing easily. There were moments of laughter and moments of quiet, but the quiet ones didn't feel empty. They felt comfortable. Over the following weeks, meeting for coffee became a habit. Sometimes they sat in the cafe, other times they went to the park so Emily could take pictures while they talked. David would carry her bag, not because she asked, but because it let her move more freely with the camera. In return, she would let him see the photos first, watching his face for his reaction. Slowly, their friendship began to change things, both for Emily and for the people around her. When she came to the company's next monthly hearing, she wasn't sitting alone in the corner anymore. David was there, of course, but So were a couple of other employees who had started talking to her after seeing how easily David did. People seemed to realize she wasn't fragile glass that might break if they said the wrong thing. She was a person with stories, interests, and a sharp sense of humor. Her father noticed too. He didn't say much about it, but one afternoon, when David passed him in the hallway, the CEO gave him a short nod that felt heavier than words. It was a quiet acknowledgement, not just of David's kindness, but of the difference he had made. For Emily, these changes meant more than she could easily explain. She had spent so many years being looked at, but not truly seen. Now she found herself part of conversations, invited into moments instead of watching from the outside. She knew it had started with one decision: David choosing to walk across that banquet hall. One crisp morning in early spring, they were sitting on a park bench watching the sunrise. Emily had just taken a photo of the pale orange light spilling over the trees. She lowered her camera and looked at David. "You know," she said softly, "before that night, I was ready to leave early. I thought it would be just another evening of sitting alone." David turned his head toward her. "What made you stay?" She smiled faintly. "You did." They didn't need to say much after that. The moment spoke for itself. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was about the quiet, steady way someone's presence could turn loneliness into connection. As the sun climbed higher, Emily scrolled through the pictures she had taken that morning. She stopped at one, a shot of the park bathed in golden light, with two silhouettes sitting on a bench in the corner of the frame. She hadn't realized she had captured them. She showed it to David, and he chuckled. "Guess we're part of the scenery now." Emily looked at the picture again and shook her head. "No," she said softly, "we're part of the story." And in that simple truth, she knew something important. She didn't have to wait for someone to see her anymore. She had been seen, and she had learned she could let herself be. That knowledge would stay with her, shaping the way she moved through the world. It had all started with a black man noticing a girl in the corner and asking, "Shall we sit?" But the real change had come from everything that followed. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every quiet moment where neither of them had to pretend. In the months to come, they would continue to meet, to talk, and to watch the seasons change together. And for Emily, the memory of that first night would always be more than just a story. It would be the beginning of a chapter where she finally stepped into the center of her own life, no longer just watching from the edges.